Well, welcome to our devotional interlude. Whatever time of the day it might be, pray that it will edify you and might ring a bell in your heart that needs to be rung. Today we're going to be in chapters 4 and 5 of 2 Corinthians, as I mentioned yesterday. And this section of Scripture is talking about the glory of Jesus that indwells every believer. I want to repeat that because the Scripture here says, "Let the light shine, for God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure," he says, "in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." So this is the treasure that we have. This is something rich and wonderful, an inheritance, the Scripture refers to in that sense too. He says in verse 7 of chapter 4 that we have this treasure in jars of clay. He's talking about our human bodies, which are fragile, breakable, and temporary, like a clay pot. Perhaps the most common of household utensils, but clay pots are easy to break. A very ordinary vessel, very useful and practical, but perishable. In the verses that follow this description, Paul enumerates the things that expose the vulnerabilities of our physical bodies. Afflicted in every way, he says, perplexed, persecuted, struck down are phrases that describe the things that impact our well-being and our physical well-being. These words call to mind the sufferings that he enumerates in 2 Corinthians 11, shipwrecks, stonings, and a long list of sufferings. And he says, as a footnote, "Who is weak, and I am not weak." So he's talking about his ability to identify with people in their weakness. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 11 to 15, Paul also speaks of a bodily ailment that he had when he was ministering among the Galatians. In verse 13, he speaks of his ailment, which was a trial to him and to them. And then in verse 15, he acknowledges their selfless compassion for him in the middle of his ailment. He says, "You would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me," he says in his Galatian letter. So this sickness had to have been related to his vision, to his eyes. And of course, eye difficulties were very common in semi-arid parts of the world, semi-desert areas where dust and other things can carry sicknesses into people's eyes. Perhaps this is what he's referring to in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 when he refers to the famous thorn in the flesh in verses 5 to 10 of chapter 12. He says that he had asked to be healed 3 times, he said, and God had not yet healed him. But God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Somehow he found that he could carry on without being healed because of God's power active through him in spite of his physical thorn in the flesh. You know, as we get older, it seems probable that we will all experience gradual slowing down of our physical and mental abilities in spite of our best efforts to stay healthy, in spite of medications and in spite of medical procedures. But Paul's discovery of God's grace is also a promise to you and I that we can draw on that same grace in the midst of our clay pot lives. So I wonder what you're experiencing in this fallible shell of a person that we are, which we call our body. It's also called the tent. In chapter 5, verses 1 to 10, Paul speaks of the body as the tent, which is our earthly home. He says in verse 1 that someday it will be destroyed. That is to say, it's bound to perish. If you have ever enjoyed camping, you know that the use of a tent and the impact of the weather on it, the tents wear out. The floors begin to shred, the roof begins to leak, the mosquitoes find ways of getting in to attack us while we're sleeping. And we can patch and repatch, we can sew and repair, but ultimately we need to get a new tent. But there is another house not made with hands, says Paul in this chapter, that we groan to put on. A heavenly dwelling, says Paul, a heavenly dwelling. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. And we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. But we have one last camping trip to make, and it is to be absent from this earthly tent, our bodies, and at home in the presence of the Lord. This is our Christian hope. We can lay down our clay pot bodies, our old and tattered tents, and receive a new dwelling from the Lord in heaven. So may the Lord encourage you with these words today. Perhaps you're dealing with some of those physical or memory issues that are part of getting older. May God encourage you with the hope, the word of encouragement and hope that Paul gives us in 2 Corinthians chapters 4 and 5. Bless your day. Bye.